Hey, this is Sabrina, Monarch of Monarch Astrology and Magic of the Spheres podcast, back to continue a new series on Pluto and aspect in the natal chart. I already have out a video about Pluto and aspect in general and Sun Pluto, which you can find on my channel. And now we'll get into the aspect between Moon and Pluto. So this is for you if you have this, or you are getting to know this aspect for someone else or for your clients. So this aspect is emotionally intense. The individual's perceptions and rhythms are tinted by the god of the underworld. Thus, this is a deeply feeling and deeply perceiving placement. And the lesson for this placement is emotional empowerment. With Pluto aspects, we have a general arc of disempowerment to empowerment within the storyline of the native's life. And the challenge is feeling deeply consumed by one's own emotions, right? Or feeling just simply disempowered by the emotional intensity, or having some kind of emotional process that one can't figure out or move through all the way, etc. There may also, however, be a strong need for emotional catharsis, and often Moon Pluto individuals will channel their very intense feelings into art, performance, music, and they can be super magnetic and have this kind of hypnotic allure. A lot of musicians, a lot of actors and actresses have this. Our deepest imprints in this life of receiving care come from being an infant, right? So just in this life, when we're talking about karmic astrology or Pluto, we're often looking at the soul, and the imprint of the soul from prior lives as well. But at least if we track it in this life alone, we can go back to infancy, where we're helpless and dependent on our caretakers. We can also, with Moon Pluto, look at certain parts of childhood, maybe, where the individual felt emotionally neglected. Not always because of nefarious or terrible parenting. There can just be the general kind of failures of parenting, right? Like no parenting job is perfect. But situations in early life where the individual felt just kind of emotionally abandoned, and then learned that patterning of emotionally abandoning themselves. But let's take it back to infancy. And if we trace our need for care and nurturing to the root, we can see the core vulnerability of needing another and not having the power to fulfill that need ourselves, right? To be utterly dependent, as well as the intense feelings of love, relief, or safety that we feel when from that profound core vulnerability, we're actually taken care of. And the ways that receiving that care literally allowed us to develop. So as that goes on in a native's life who has Moon Pluto, they can be especially sensitive to receiving a certain kind of care or touch or nurturing, as well as they also have the power to give that. And the power also to make others dependent or addicted on their care at a shadow level. Emotional disempowerment for these individuals comes from bottomless need, such as the infant state without awareness or context of time or object permanence, right? So if you're an infant having a big emotion, you don't have a concept of time. It could be eternity that you're feeling that upset. Or bottomless need because the root need was not taken care of, so the emotion didn't complete or move, right? We want deep approaches and solutions when it comes to Pluto, and not something superficial. And so Moon Pluto, you can have a situation where the individual is addicted to certain forms of comfort or certain superficial kind of soothings, but they don't actually get to the root. The bottomless need state is like an infant crying out to be consoled, who is never consoled. Moon Pluto people often have some kind of deep cord of emotional abandonment or emotional neglect that becomes a black hole-like for them. If they try to have others fulfill these needs for them, they are often disappointed or even devastated when they don't receive the care that they are searching for. It's like the universe conspires to have them transform how they source emotional wellness. When care is nowhere to be found around them, they will have to take care of themselves or open up to new channels of support. Now, that may sound intense and pointed, because as an experience, it really is, to feel like absolutely abandoned, like, black hole, bottomless need, and feel like the bottom has just dropped out and there's endless like abandon. It's not permanent. It's an emotional wave or a state. And there's something about the transformation of approaching that. And I come to you as someone that has a Moon Pluto aspect and have had those kind of moments of just absolute despair and feeling like it'll never get better, and having different arcs of figuring out how to actually move that emotion, how to really grieve, how to really take care and nurture myself and have that situation become better. But when we're looking at just that plutonic, like outer planet underworld experience of an emotional wave, what do we do with that? Right. And so a person could get stuck in that or really be in some deeply disempowered state, like chronically in some kind of state, or we're looking at transformation and transmutation. And so having a discovery that, well, maybe if I do some kind of artistic thing, if I express myself in some way, if I move my body in a certain way, if I change my diet even, or my relationship with nourishment, like having these breakthroughs about how to move with the energy. But this isn't, again, just about like routines or like basic superficial cures. I mean, it could be about learning how to really ride these deep waves of emotion and open up to that deeper transpersonal thing that is coming through. We can also look at Moon Pluto with certain things around the personality or the ego or the comfort zone. Moon Pluto person or the Moon Pluto person often likes to have things be just so. They can be especially sensitive to things not being their preference, right? They feel empowered by their comfort zone and disempowered by being thrown out of it, as well as having deeper layers of like, maybe they feel disempowered by their comfort zone because they need these very particular conditions to exist and thrive. And maybe at times in life, they really want to break out of that and expand past that shell. So on the one hand, their strong awareness of preference and their laser focus on it can have a way of being magical or creative. Moon Pluto is even associated with witchcraft, like weaving one's environment intentionally with deep psychic power. So think about like designing your apartment or room or house and designing it to be a reflection of your desire, a reflection of the deepest essence within you. You'd probably have a really fucking magical experience in that house that's reflecting that deeper aspect of you. Right? It might even call in or like be a kind of spider web that attracts your desires to you because you've built your web. Moon Pluto really does have an association with spiders, by the way. But the particular preferences and sensitivities, this comfort zone, may also be limitations they are pressed to change in certain times of their lives. You might have cyclical times where having this really intense routine, you eat at certain times of the day, or you have this workout routine, or you have like a deep kind of schedule and you're like in a zone where it allows you to have a particular kind of reality, but you can't live that way forever. And so eventually you have to break out of that comfort zone that you built for yourself. Right. And there may be something too, let's consider this developmentally. Maybe a Moon Pluto person never had the capacity to construct and design their own living space. Maybe they felt kind of infringed upon by the environment or circumstances, and they didn't have that capacity to really cast their own web. And so if at a certain point in their lives, they actually do get to create that web, that comfort zone, that routine, that environment around them, that may enable them to have a certain experience that they were never capable of having before. And then they'll also grow out of it, right? Like a crab getting a new shell. The intensity of this individual's emotions will catalyze emotional confrontations and transformations in their lifetime, right? We have the moon, their emotional body in contact with the god of the underworld. And so stuff is going to come up. We often change because we can no longer bear the way things are. Moon Pluto people can make powerful healers, or they have this Kali Mama kind of energy. like the person who can be a witness to other people's deepest sufferings and not flinch, right? And even have advice or insight or some kind of healing capacity, because they themselves have such deep emotional bandwidth and range and have undergone various initiations, typo here, and ego deaths, such that they found a deeper power within themselves beyond their comfort zone. They found a deeper well of nourishment. Right? Like that Moon Pluto experience that I was talking about of like the bottomless need or that kind of like emotional hellscape, it feels like there's no way out, right? Or it's like this epic struggle with Pluto. And when an individual makes it through the gate of that initiation, that turns into power, right? Like they are less bothered maybe by smaller things, or they have a deeper capacity within themselves to recognize that they can make it through really intense experiences. And, we can consider too, like, Pluto is always going to kind of bring that intensity, but there may also be a process of letting go of addictions to particular kinds of intensity, right? There's the intensity that is just there and we can't avoid and it comes up. There's also the intensity that we create with unnecessary drama or emotional addictions and whatnot. So that might be something that this individual works with as well. And so back to themes of dependency, right? Because the Moon Pluto, there's a really deep desire to be taken care of, right? To be nourished, to be supported. There may also be a repulsion around that, because Pluto has that kind of attracting and repelling quality to it. And so this person's relationship with care and nourishment has some spikes to it in their own way, right? This is going to be more complex based on the sign and house placement and the individual's life experiences and free will and all of that. But everyone needs to be taken care of, right? We all need support and care and nourishment. And it's not to say the Moon Pluto person must be on their own or that they can't ever feel safe or like they're receiving care. However, there's a secret infant in this person screaming out with need. And I'm sorry for the difficult image, but this whole series is provocative because it's Pluto. And I say secret because it hides behind the particular circumstances, but the intensity itself comes from a very primordial, preverbal, deeply instinctual place, right? So a person may be really upset about a situation at work or a situation in their relationship, but the being inside of them that's upset is a little bit younger or a lot younger. It's a child or an infant version of them. And it's projected onto the current circumstances. And that is going to create kind of like an endless disempowerment cycle because you can't approach these adult situations as a little kid or as an infant. But if you can get to the root and recognize that deep, primordial, like screaming internal being and work directly with them, that's like more magical or shamanic or deep healing than having that kind of like inner infant or young inner child kind of hijack the situation. And so the intensity of this need, right? It would be, like in Harry Potter, like those plants, like mandrakes, I don't know what they're called, where you pull them up from the root and they start screaming. Like imagine having that intense, like inner screaming being inside of you and being like, well, let me just put that away, or like, I don't want to deal with that, but it's still like an undercurrent. And so to work with that directly, one needs a certain capacity or power or ability, one, to even touch that part of themselves. But then when they learn how to work with that just pure raw emotion, there's like an unstoppability kind of energy that comes into that too. But back to what I was writing here, the intensity of this need can create fear and shutdown in the individual at times because it feels too painful, right? And it doesn't make sense. It's illogical. Like, where is this coming from? So the individual may try to avoid situations which trigger it, like entering relationships where the person feels they need the other, right? And so it's an adult relationship or an adolescent relationship, but there's a very deep like inner child or like inner infant kind of trigger that's coming out in the situation. And that feels painful. The problem isn't that there's this screaming infant or this like powerful, emotional, illogical, irrational, like volcano inside. It's rather the continual ignoring and neglect of that aspect of oneself, right? Our deeper needs that are not necessarily logical or convenient, like just needing to cry and hold ourselves or be held, needing to wail, needing to make noises, needing to throw a tantrum, like needing to be extreme in one's embodiment, in a way that, like, you know, part of the complexity of that game is that you also are a person in society, or maybe you have a job to go to, or maybe things in your life, right? And so how does that deep inner intensity or that need for catharsis move and direct like our lives, right? How do we relate to that need for emotional catharsis? And does it fit neatly into being an artist? Or does it feel like I'm on the verge of a mental breakdown every day at work? I hate this. And like, there's something inside of that, like protest, that may be worth looking at. Or sometimes resolving that material makes the outer situation seem less intense and terrible. And that's kind of what's so confusing or illogical about the intensity of those emotions. But we're looking at, with Moon Pluto, essentially a deeper realization through the native's life of how can they take care of this intense inner emotional life, or these deep needs, these deep instincts, in a way that that emotional neglect or emotional self-betrayal isn't occurring anymore, where there's like an allyship of like that deep emotional impulse inside, and how it's going to move through one's life in a way that's actually really powerful or magical or in alignment with the person, right? I mean, the moon and Pluto, the moon in evolutionary astrology relates to the ego, right? And Pluto is the soul. So there is some kind of conversation between ego and soul. And the soul is more powerful than the ego, right? But the ego is necessary for day-to-day survival and whatnot on this earth plane. And so there's a give and take, or a conversation or a transformation that's happening between them. The moon Pluto person's inner world can be very dramatic. It can be like Richard Tarna's described it as like an opera. And that always stuck with me. So having like an operatic life. And if they can accept rather than resist how deeply they feel, they can take responsibility for working with those feelings. The projection of this intense need or desire to be nurtured onto an external caretaker can relate to challenging dynamics in relationships, such as dependency, intense need of another, repelling others, feeling shame about one's neediness, or attracting people with resonant entanglements, like a person who needs to be needed in a way that they're also playing out a complex. So this can take so many different forms. It can be very nuanced or unique for the individual, but we can take an example of like when a person has such intense need or desire that they know if they bring that out into the relationship, that it will be very repelling to the person that they ended up attracting, right? It can be kind of like that insecure attachment style, where there's this deep fear and shame of the need. And the experience, the conditioning that if I reveal how deeply I need you, you'll never want to talk to me again. So a kind of like not showing the full need, but having this like private inner struggle, right? Versus like being really having the emotional empowerment of being in relationship with one's needs and desires, approving of them, not having shame of them, and being able to call in relationships or relate to people who want to participate, want to be in that dynamic. And it's not feeling like it's like a chess game of, you know, I'll withhold this information or act this way so that you'll give me what I need, and like that whole thing, which can be really agonizing for a moon Pluto person. Right. And so the moon Pluto, when it comes to dependency, it can be the individual themselves feeling really dependent. It can also be that they have gained some kind of power to create dependency in others. like I think a lot of, I should have grabbed some quotes, but like The Weeknd's kind of lyrics, I think he has Moon in Scorpio, and like it's very close to Moon Pluto because he has Pluto in Scorpio too. But I feel like a lot of the lyrics have this kind of vibe of like, this sex is so good, you're going to need it. You're never going to forget it. You'll need me kind of thing. And so Pluto, like Moon, that can also be like where the person is like developing a certain kind of intense attraction, allure within themselves, and also being like, you need this. And there's a degree to which, yeah, I don't know. There's something about Moon Pluto, if we want to talk about it in like a sexuality way, where there's like really a tenderness with the moon and a sense of like, this feels good. You feel safe. Like you feel like perfectly attuned to, perfectly touched. This is addictive, like this level of support and attunement and care, whether the person is on the receiving or giving end of that, or, in a best case scenario where it's like a mutual thing and it's not addictive or toxic, but there's actually just like such a depth of attunement and such a depth of relationality and like a very, very deep intimacy that's shared and that's mutually enhancing for both parties. One of the things I think I talked about in the intro video about Pluto aspects is that we're looking at places where with Pluto, we go from a disempowerment to empowerment axis, and where also we go from trying to get something and trying to like extract something for our own gain, or being on the other side of that, being extracted from and being in like abuse dynamics versus, and the parts of us that hook into that, versus where we create more mutually enhancing connections. So you can imagine kind of like the story arc of going from being deeply dependent and emotionally disempowered to having greater emotional empowerment, emotional intelligence, and creating deep intimacy that isn't full of like toxic threads. Not to be Puritan and perfect about it, right? But like increasingly empowered. As much as the Moon Pluto person wants to be consoled or taken care of by some external party, and perhaps correct the ways they felt emotionally neglected earlier in life, the necessity of doing reparenting or self-care work is present. When the individual lovingly, humbly tends to this raw dimension of themselves, acknowledging their emotions, learning how to not even just cope with emotions, but really how to channel those emotions and how to be in alignment with them, learning how to make life decisions that increase overall well-being, right? So like if you have a chronic external circumstance that's really not supportive to your development, the individual or like the personal empowerment to move away from those circumstances and move towards something like more life enhancing. But when the individual is like really in relationship to this raw dimension of their emotional life, and they're no longer excessively projecting that raw emotional life onto external people or circumstances, right? Which is, from an infant state, we are absolutely helpless, right? Like we are at kind of the whims of our environment and caretakers. And to whatever degree, we're still holding on to that sense of basic powerlessness, right? And only like in very extreme cases, like a person actually being in that powerlessness, total powerlessness and like adult life and whatnot. But thinking about like generally having like a safe and free existence to the extent of a normal person. So we can get far out about ways we're not free, etc. But having like the deconditioning of that psychological sense of helplessness, where there's something about like, I feel so intensely and therefore I'm like at the whims of it, versus like the surrender to the way that wants to flow through, challenging thing to work with a Moon Pluto person. But as this person finds that kind of deeper resonance with their emotional life, miraculously, the environment also begins to seem more caring and abundant for that individual. Sometimes when I talk about Moon Pluto, my own bias is that I'm Moon in Taurus opposite Pluto and Scorpio. And one of the major things that I've had to learn with that placement is emotional self-reliance. So badly wanting to be taken care of by the other to this extreme extent of like, my life being defined by someone else, like the perfect partner or something like that. And how life wouldn't give it to me. Like I was so willing to just like be self-abandoned and like let someone else like take care of me, but I couldn't find it, couldn't attract it, right? And so I figured out eventually like I need to learn how to take care of myself. And it was like this weird thing where like the more that I took care of myself, the more other people seemingly wanted to like support me too. I was like, at the beginning of that, it was such an extreme contrast because what I really desired from that more immature state was like, let me just like collapse and like let someone else do the job for me. And like, if I then started to find it in myself, then someone else wanted to do that for me. I was like, what? Like, I already got over the need to have it externally. Now, why is it showing up? And realizing that ultimately, like the deeper gift of Moon and Taurus is that kind of sense of self-reliance and the power that that then gives to attract these higher quality relationships because they're not based on intense mutual need, but there's a greater degree of choice and free will, not feeling compelled at some addictive level. So relationship and care could still come from an external source, but it wasn't supposed to be a substitute for self-reliance. We could also say generally that the Moon Pluto person is learning what true nourishment is and how to receive and be in relationship to true nourishment, as opposed to being addicted to false or compensatory sources of nourishment. Right. So nourishment, real nourishment helps us grow and develop. And you can think about like a child and them having like good shelter, safety, like access to education, good, healthy food, like whatever it is, as opposed to junk food or hours and hours of television. Yet when we think about Pluto also, Pluto's very alchemical. Pluto can digest and transmute a lot, not necessarily just perfect circumstances. So there may also be a type of medicine or magic that a Moon Pluto person has based on how they've transmuted and alchemized what wasn't ideal or what wasn't really nourishing. But then as there's more power that the individual has to really be nourished, they can make increasingly empowered choices around how they nourish, as opposed to going toward soothing or addictive comforts that aren't really helpful just because it is like a Band-Aid for how emotionally intense they feel. And as I was mentioning earlier, the charts of actors, actresses, and musicians seem to have an abnormally high population of Moon Pluto people or Moon and Scorpio people, which is a similar energy. And why would this be? Right? Moon Pluto people have such deep emotions that they can channel this cathartic intensity into their art. When these individuals discover self-possession and how to be in their own power, they can be truly alluring. Right? So really think about like when you see a really captivating or powerful performance, what is that person channeling? And often a Moon Pluto person has that kind of power to channel really deep feeling. And the challenge of that placement is simply how to work with channeling that. It's like having like a fire hose of intensity or something and figuring out in your life, like, what do I do with all this energy? And finding the ways for it to really move and not get like stuck into certain like loops or addictions or channels, but how it can like really be a force of evolution in the person and in their life. So to close us out, I want to share a poem that my friend Katie Avila wrote. And this was shared on Instagram, and I asked her for permission to share it. I felt like it was such the Moon Pluto vibe, and it's titled Mother. I am addicted to half and half. My body is craving milk, like a child pursing their lips, a sucking. I think it's something about nourishment. I've been starved of milk and honey and love and affection. I don't really blame mom anymore. I know it's not her fault. It's a wound much older than time. The separation from the womb, the earth, the void, the first grief, the first gasp of air, and then the first cry, our first loss right at birth. Does anyone really know how to feel nourished in this world? Maybe it's not that I've been starved, but I've starved myself, cut my own cord. I'm trying to find the woman in me whose belly is full with birth, whose skin glows with sun kiss, whose body is soft and giving. I'm trying to find the mother in me so that she can hold me, so that I stop smoking, drinking, eating, sucking, numbing, trying to fuck my way back to comfort. I'm trying to find my way into my own womb. I think the nectar is there in the blood. So in closing, with Moon Pluto, I hope that if you have this aspect, it's not like a 1, 2, 3 easy solution. This is how you feel better or master it or something. It's really, with Pluto aspects, a lifelong learning, right? Like Pluto is a force of evolution, and evolution works through us personally. And so whatever layers of emotional disempowerment to empowerment we're working with, it's really, I think, a mystery working with Moon Pluto. Pluto is very, we could say any Pluto aspect is being engaged with the mystery, but Moon Pluto, it's so connected to our filter of perception and our emotions, and going through these kind of cyclical discoveries or transmutations of how to be in relationship with ourselves in a way that we feel so much more intimate with ourselves, so much more intimate with the deep thing that is inside of us, and that we have proper outlet strategies, understandings of how to be with that really deep material inside. And so essentially, it's learning how to be friends with that emotional volcanic energy inside, as opposed to feeling like just completely at the whim of it, or not knowing how to relate to it or how to deal with it. So one thing, part of me is like, I connected to Moon Pluto, like I researched it at a young age when I was struggling the most intensely with it. And it was so validating. It was so intense, but it also was like, well, what do I do? And it's really been an ongoing journey of learning. But it helped to know that there was something on the other side, that the sense of dependency or the sense of emotional disempowerment or the sense of being repulsive, like having these emotional needs that were like repelling, and that it wasn't, like the hint of promise that could change and be radically different was a guiding light through the process of learning different things to take care of myself better, to back my own emotions or not abandon myself, and to really invest in things in my life and invest in a path that would support me in being emotionally intimate with myself. So if you are kind of in the Moon Pluto struggle or feeling like everything's so intense, it does get better. But it's looking for a path that's not superficial, so not something that just soothes. Maybe soothing is like temporarily helpful when that's all we know how to do, but finding something deeper and more radical that supports our emotional development in this life. So let me know. I forgot to say at the beginning, please like this video. It's really supportive and helpful. Like always, like the video, subscribe. I'll be sharing more of these videos, and then let me know in the comments if you have this aspect, how you resonated with it, any thoughts, anything you want to share. Thank you so much for watching.